and welcome to Let Them Talk. Thanks for joining us. We have a great show in store for you. Our subject is going to be poetry, and our guest is a poet, Uche Nduka, right?
Yes,
I got it right?
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Thanks.
Yes.
Great to have you, Uche. And you're a poet, and a published poet at that. And we're also going to talk about a mutual friend of ours who's been a guest on this show a few times, and this is her book. That's Gabrielle Don, who her book which just came out of poetry, is Living Without Skin, and you have Living in Public,
Yes.
right? That's your book of poetry. You're a beautiful poet, and we love having poets on this show because poetry, of course, is made to be listened to. You have to read it to people, and people have to listen to it.
Yes.
I mean, you could read it in a book, but it's always best to hear, especially the poet themselves, read their poetry, right? And here we are live on television, covering all Manhattan and by MNN all around the world. People are watching us everywhere, and this is our opportunity. So welcome, Uche, to our show, Let Them Talk.
Thank you.
You hail originally from Nigeria?
Yes.
But you've lived in Europe and here in America. How long have you been outside of Nigeria, and what brought you to the...
Practically, I left Nigeria in 1994 for Germany, when I got an artist fellowship by the Goethe Institute. And I lived in Germany for about 8 years. Then I moved on to Holland. I lived there for about 3, in Amsterdam specifically. And then after that, I moved to New York about 11 years ago. And since then, I've been living here. So in a way, I've been in a sort of on a tour of 3 continents so far.
Mm-hmm. Right, very good. And so, how long have you been a poet? Did you start out as in poetry? Was your original original love, or did you move on?
Yes, but I always say, I always put it this way: that poetry came to me. Poetry found me when I was 13 years old in the secondary school. It wasn't anything planned. It's just that I loved reading a lot. And I discovered, or rather the teacher, then my secondary school teacher, discovered I was writing poetry, because really I was just trying to sneak in some letters to my then girlfriend. And he discovered it by accident and later called me in and said, "Do you know what you are writing?" And then I said, "No." He says, "These are like poems." Just that way. Mm-hmm. But still, I didn't really take him on his words. I just
the power of a good teacher, right?
Yes,
it's the most important thing.
He located it,
right?
And threw some books in my direction. Shakespeare, Auden, for instance, Stephen Spender, even Allen Ginsberg, and since then, I've had this engagement with that particular medium, because it's a medium that takes a lot out of you, but it also gives a lot.
Right. Is New York City, of course, and the East Village, especially Lower East Side, I like to call it, is sort of ground zero for poetry in the world, because of some of the people you just mentioned who are from there, and I guess San Francisco as well. People like Allen Ginsberg and the whole Beat generation.
Philip Lamantia, Gary Snyder, that whole group, Diane de Prima, even down to Anne Waldman. They would say that the first people that caught my interest. Right. Because there's something about the way they explore dailiness. They didn't just present poetry as something that's just about the moon and the skies. They wrote about their cigarettes. They wrote about their sneakers. They wrote about the walk they took on the street, just like Frank O'Hara. They demystified poetry, and in that particular exercise, energized it. So I didn't see that. I didn't come in as an interloper. I found myself as belonging to such people who wants to explore authenticity, humbly and loudly at the same time.
We were talking about Gabrielle, our friend, and how I met Gabrielle was through David Peel.
Yeah,
and we were talking about David Peel,
yes.
who, in a way, he was a musician poet.
Yes.
I mean, poets are musicians in a way, aren't they? They write these songs, in a way, right? And I used to love his simple lyrics about his authentic life that attracted people like John Lennon, who saw him, right? So how do you define poetry to people? What is it? What makes poetry different than writing interesting prose or even cutting edge prose?
Well, it's a very difficult question, but personally,
I've been fighting with it all my life. I
yes,
can't figure out the difference.
it's. I always say my definition of poetry keeps changing, because if you have to actually be a practitioner of that art, the art of poetry, you have to be as vigilant, meaning that you have to let the poem take you where it wants to go. It's not really about finding a definitive definition of it, because, for instance, some of the things I'm writing recently, they seem prose-like. They seem in between stuff. They seem like pieces of dialogue. But as far as I'm concerned, they're all poems. So my definition of poetry can be definitive, in a way. I just say it as a way of living. Poetry is a way of life, a way of being, and a way of trying to do what? Embrace the world in a very, very authentic way. Trying to know that, look, despite whatever is happening outside in the world, politically and all that, the spirit grounds us. There is something also very, very spiritual about poetry, and that is the humbling element. Knowing that no matter how big you are in this world, you're going to leave it one day. And you're not going to leave the universe with any of your fame or money or house or influence. Just discovering that particular fact does something to you as a person. For me, it inspires my art, knowing that, look, each day brings something for you to write about. So I don't know anything about having a writer's block, for instance.
Mm-hmm. So you're multilingual. Is there any language more than any other that you've spoken and worked in that lends itself to poetry more than any other, or that it doesn't matter?
Yeah, for me, it doesn't matter much, because I grew up to begin with bilingually. My parents taught me Igbo language, which is my mother tongue in Nigeria, and English at the same time. They were speaking both. The same thing in school. We wrote in Igbo and we wrote in English, and that has somehow fed into the type of work I do. It blew, at least when I started taking myself seriously as a poet, I would say it just blew my work into a kind of a cosmopolitan stance, which is embrace the whole world. My poetry refused borders. I don't believe in borders. I don't believe too much in this race construction. I don't believe in walls, particularly.
Like our dear president and his infamous wall that he never shuts up about.
You see, mentioning him at times actually gives me the rashes, because I don't personally accept him as my president. He is, yes, officially and all that, but from where I stand, I don't really accept him, because I think that he is not doing well for the people in what he ought to do in that position. It's somebody actually who I think is trying to destroy the democratic mindset that made this country. Democratic mindset is a very, very important thing that everybody in this country seems to have and need to have. But that man and the people around him seems to want to smash it. Because of what? Greed and ambition and so on.
The tendency to turn around to the person next to you and say, do you want to do this?
Yes.
Before you just do it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And if you're in a group of people, what do you all want to do?
Yes.
Some of you want to do this, some of you want to do that.
Yes.
Let's do this.
Yes.
Right. And you have that in the United States in the culture.
Yes.
He's trying to wipe it out and just turn it into a strongman culture, one guy telling everybody what to do all the time.
And that has to be fought. That's my own stance of it. People should not think that this is something light, that this is something soft, that, it will blow away. No, because I think when you start poisoning people's spirit and people's minds, that's how you destroy any place. Whether it is an institution or whether it's a school or whether it's a nation, once you start poisoning people's mind and the way they think. And this particular regime here, I feel they are dumbing down this country. They are disrespecting the artists who have lived here, the mystics, the thinkers who have given their lives, even from Thoreau down to Emerson, right down to Ginsberg, right down to all these people that are still with us. He is practically an antithesis of what these people stood for. So there's no reason why I would say I would really, really like this present government.
You joined the club. I think we're probably in good company right now. So you mentioned some traditional, American poets from the traditional days going back. You mentioned Thoreau.
Yes.
I don't know, Emerson.
Yes.
Who are the ones you like? Those are two right there, right? And
yes.
Are you influenced by those old timers?
Oh yes,
old schoolers?
Walt Whitman. Yes. Emily Dickinson.
Quintessential New Yorker.
Emily Dickinson,
Yeah.
for instance, I just went visiting her house about 2 months ago with my family, and we were really thrilled that, we were in the space where she actually sat and wrote those poems, which I've been reading from my teenage years right down to now. I teach her her poems in class. So those people, I think, also helped shape who I became, not just as a writer, as a poet, but also as a person.
You teach poetry? Is that specifically?
I teach literature and creative writing in Queen's College. Yes, in general.
And how about your students? What do you think? How do they come prepared?
Some of them do, because it's always a mixed bag. You find out within a class, some people who are really, really keen to learn what you are teaching, and some others who just seem completely abstracted, who seem zoned out, out of that scene. But part of what I enjoy about doing that, actually teaching the younger people here, is that I'm turning them on to people who they never even knew lived in this country. These people I'm talking about, who I regard as global messengers of peace, love, justice, these are Americans who lived here. So when I mention the name, for instance, let me say, give a current example, John Ashbery. I really feel embarrassed that some of them don't actually know who Ashbery was. Right. Or I mentioned someone like Frank O'Hara, or I mentioned somebody like Barbara Guest, or even Bernadette Mayer. These are, some of them are still living, people I'm mentioning. And I said, these are people who practically are holding up this country as far as I'm concerned. They are the spiritual leaders of this country. And I think that you younger people have to tap into their energy if you really want to be able to do what? Have the strength to live fully in this place and manifest the greatness, what I call the potential greatness of this country.
It's in difficult political times like this, and back in the Vietnam War days and before that, in other times when this country was under great stress, that there was artistic flowering and opening. And I think you find that all over the world. Whenever a country or people are in a time of political stress, you see arts, music, culture, poetry, things like that really start to speak. People are trying to speak what's on their mind. So to all those folks out there, it's not enough just to going out and protesting and holding signs is great, but we have to create a rebellious form of art. And poetry is a great way to start, I think. That's where you can really get into your soul and what you're about.
I agree completely.
So this is your book, Living
in Public.
Living in Public. Who publishes it? It's
Christiania Collective.
Right.
It's a writers collective based in Brooklyn.
Right. And where is it available? Where
it's in a small press distribution, SPD, distributed nationally.
So wherever good poetry is sold in your community.
Yes.
Right.
All right.
Would you be into reading something for us?
Oh yes.
We'd love to hear it.
If you like me to.
Appreciate it.
It's a book of. It's just numbered. It's a book numbered from 1 to 168 poems. So I just try to read about 3 brief ones because they are not the same length, so to say. So I read poem 5 to begin with. And love thickening in blood road. In this room, the air is full of you. I can't read. I can't sleep. You can't ever fall from dichotomies. Neither can I.
Nice.
Yes, and the next poem is poem 7. Pushing up through distracted soil, on loop, freaking out alone in my room. On April 9th, 2015, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, murderer and thief, got toppled and removed from Cape Town. Writing on several fronts at once, Mary pranking, I am in no way ahead of my own time. You shouldn't let other people take your risks for you. The flourish of a line, its hub, its blaze, its zenith, each train hopping erases the other. There is no remedy for longing. Poem 15. Don't be afraid of the broken crown, brush cut, blue irises, pageant that renews the clover, bushiness or the gossip of good news. Tip your rapture 1 second before the perfect mist.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So folks can actually hear you read, and also Gabrielle, because her book as well, coming up on May 22nd, right?
Yes.
And I actually have it.
Yes.
I have the information here. I have to pull it out on my phone, but it should be right here. Hang on 1 second. Now the whole world knows my code, right? And let's see what we got here. Hang on. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. So here it is. It's just restarting. Wait, I don't know why that happened. Why is this not happening? So tell us a little bit about this poetry book. Is there anything you're specifically talking about? In other words, what is is there a singular focus, or is each poem a separate thing?
They overlap. The poems in the book overlap. And they usually treat some of the themes even I've dealt with before. Themes of social progress, political revolution, mysticism, sexuality, love, and just the art of celebrating joy, knowing that life is not only about struggles alone. Life is not about just only enemy making, but what? Celebration. I think we tend to forget so much that there is so much beauty around us, and we just tend to lash on to either anger, revenge, or to those things that provoke us, that practically make us fight 24 hours a day. And I feel that fine, there are battles, but these are lifelong battles. So why don't we also know that, appreciate beauty that's around us, the beauty in us and the beauty that's around us. And this beauty comes from other people. It comes from the natural spaces, landscapes. It comes from urbanscapes, gardens, flowers, the sky itself, the oceans, the rivers. We intend so much to be on almost like a battle ready. And I find that we overdo it these days, of course, knowing the political situation. But I think that it is also that joy itself is resistance. Joy is resistance. That we have to take care of ourselves and each other so that we don't forget pleasure. We don't forget creativity. We don't forget happiness. People might regard that as sentimental. I don't. And even if they call it sentimentality, I think sentimentality is beautiful. Love, people dismiss as sentimentality. I don't think I can exist without love. I need other people. I need to be able to receive love and give love unremittingly, without apologies. And these are all some of the themes that this particular book is talking about. And I see that actually is the conversation the book has with Gabrielle Dawn's book. Because she completely titled her book without even knowing of the title of my own book.
Right. Oh, really? So it's not coordinated. Although you guys are reading together. And by the way, I have here Living with Uche Nduka and Gabrielle Dawn.
Yes.
Gabrielle Dawn, I should say.
Yes.
And that's Wednesday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. at Burl's Brooklyn Poetry Shop, 141 Front Street, New York, New York.
In Dumbo.
In Dumbo, right?
Yes,
it's not New York, New York. It's Brooklyn, New York.
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
So anyway, it's right by the F train, right? When you get off the F train.
Yes, exactly, by the F train.
Not High Street. High Street's the A train.
After High.
Yeah.
After High. York.
Right. York Street.
Yes,
that's it. The last one,
Street,
right? York, right? The one right before you go into the city. So into Manhattan. So, but right there, York Street stop on the F train. It's right around the corner from there. Burl's Brooklyn Poetry Shop, 141 Front Street in Brooklyn. And that's Wednesday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Living, Uche Nduka and Gabrielle Dawn. And they're going to be reading their poetry. And of course, you can it's on Facebook. I'm reading it now. So just look for Living with Uche Nduka and Gabrielle Dawn on Facebook. And you'll get all the information there. And you can invite your friends and tell everybody about it. And you can hear this poetry read also live, because we're live right now.
Thank you for letting them know.
Oh yeah, I know. We're going to let them know again. And this is Gabrielle's book, and she's not with us today because Gabrielle is going through some changes, some very nice, very good changes.
Yes.
And I didn't want to drag her here because now's not the time. Yes. But hopefully
you can read it.
We'll have her after she goes through her ordeal. We'll have her on. This is her poetry, and she's a wonderful poet. I mean, she's been on the show many times, and you know how great she is. And so both of you guys are going to be performing together, which is great. And in a way, is reading poetry performing? Is it you consider performing in the same way a singer performs or an artist performs?
No, I think it's actually more of a spiritual exercise because you are giving and receiving energy. Right. It's not just a one-way thing of just the poet standing there like priests and just blessing the crowd and all that. I think both the poet and the audience make the moment happen. And that moment is is very, very charged with both public attention and mystical efflorescence.
Right. That's interesting. So it's important, the connection between the reader and the listeners, the audience.
Yes, because the poem journeys to a reader or to a hearer, and it's never entirely complete until it gets to a reader or a hearer.
Oh.
It's part of it. So the poet is in the position of a vessel. You know, you're just passing on what the universe has given you. You pass it on, and it goes out there.
Great. I had the honor many years ago of watching Allen Ginsberg give a performance. I mean, and I call that it was a performance with him, but it was a connection. Like you're saying, the audience was unbelievable, the connection. And it was maybe 1,000 people in a space over on 4th Street. It's no longer available as a space. It was like a rock concert.
Oh, yeah.
And when he read, people were screaming when he read those long poems he does those long, like 20-minute long poems, and he's just reading it and reading it and reading it, and the energy in the room was just building to a crescendo. It was better than any rock concert I've been to.
Lots of them of that generation. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, for instance, who just turned 100, he does the same thing.
Right.
If you see him read, in fact, some days, I remember The Last Waltz, know, which is a tribute to Bob Dylan. He actually read, you know, in between the musicians. Yes, he just came out, intoned some poem, and went back.
Right.
And then the jangling guitars continued.
Right. This ain't your grandma's poetry we're talking about here. This is important, what people are doing right now.
Oh, yes.
I think.
Yes.
It's very important work of art.
It's a story that never ends.
Is poetry always had its aficionados, or do you feel it's growing in popularity, or more people, or, you know, it's hard to tell because the New York people love it, and poetry is such a big part of New York life. I'm not sure if outside of New York it's really people are interested.
I think it's happening, you know, because basically I would say particularly with younger people, you know, people coming after my own generation, they're just getting turned on to poetry. If you go to Instagram and so on, there are Insta poets. People are writing to express themselves. I don't know why, you know, it's happening at this particular moment where there is such interest, you know, in terms of its growth. There's been articles written about that. But, you know, every once in a year or something, somebody writes an article about the death of poetry. Poetry is dying. Then, a few months afterwards, somebody writes another one talking about the rise of the poetry reading public.
It's died more times than...
you see? That's the thing. So, for me, as a practitioner of that craft, of that medium, I don't pay much attention whether it's growing or dying, because all I know is that part of why I'm on this planet is to write poems. So, and it has nothing to do with fashion, and it has nothing to do with which political party is in power or which president is in power. I think poetry is higher than party politics, much, much higher. That's my own estimation of it. And I take it that serious, you know. So, but still, it warms my heart to know that it seems there are more audiences these days for poetry of different types. It's not just poetry where you say a certain group of people are just turning on the whole population. Now there are various, you know, various kinds of poetry. Like I said, the internet poets, you have them. You have those who are still writing from universities. You have those who are like the slammers, who are writing right from the street. poetry is actually being
Right,
extended.
the poetry slams. There was a whole
Yes.
period when people were actually coming forward, and you were people are teaching poetry in prisons.
Yeah, yes.
And the streets. So there are poetry slams, and I've read about in prisons.
It's still happening. It's not past. Oh,
Right.
yes, there are poets I know who still teaching in prisons. And I think that is very much needed, because I think art should not be deprived from people simply because they're incarcerated. Art should not be deprived from any group. This is part of why I say that poetry is higher in a way, because when I write or when I imagine an audience, I don't really feel, oh, my political enemies should not read me, or those who, I don't agree with politically or religiously or whatever.
I don't see any poetry in the current White House. None, zero. I'm looking for it. I just see none of it.
I don't. And
It falls flat.
and even if there is prose, there is horrible prose.
Yes.
Horrible,
Right.
murderous prose. That's
Right.
what is there, which is sad, I must say.
Right. And I have to say, there were other presidents, but they were much more, who I didn't agree with either, but they were much more poetic, at least in their approach.
Oh, yes. I mean, Clinton, Obama, they were not
Obama was a great speaker.
They were not saints, but there was poetry around them.
Yeah.
I mean, right down from, J.F. Kennedy,
Right.
When Robert Frost, read at his inauguration.
Right. I thought he was, what is that famous line he read from his speech about, dude, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Right?
Oh, yes.
Right? One of the great, we still say it over and over again.
Yes.
I don't know who wrote that, but he must have written it. Right? And but you don't see that with these guys.
Too. Martin Luther King, as a figure, was
Right.
very, very poetic in every speech he wrote.
Absolutely. He was like a poem.
Yes.
Well, preachers often have it. What is it about preaching? Preacher is a good preacher, not a boring one.
Yes.
The horrible, boring ones I grew up with were like a sleeping pill in church. It was the worst thing in the world. But, then you go to, especially black church, you see, and occasionally like a Unitarians or something,
The sleepy ones, you see the sleepy ones. But most of the times, I mean, it's almost like, I call it that they're sort of calibrating passion.
Yes.
There is passion behind those words. And you can see them that they actually embody that. Because you can't actually reach anyone as a speaker if you're not excited about what you're trying to say.
Right.
You can see the excitement in these people. You can see the belief. You can see their determination that they actually want to see a change in the world.
Right. And the great political leaders of the world have always had that. Whether it was, the Nelson Mandelas or the, well, anyway, we're going to be the last 10 seconds. Thank you so much. Again, come see the presentation, which is going to be at Front Street at Burl's Brooklyn Poetry Cafe, and it's on the 22nd, 7 p.m. Be there.
Thank you.